Most of the time when I'm preaching, he asks me to speak, and there's stuff, I'm a thinker, I think about stuff. I think about stuff too much sometimes. Like, I try to figure stuff out, and there's a lot of stuff about God that's hard to figure out, And we have a lot of people that try to put God in a box. And, there's a lot of things I think he just doesn't want us to know. How do we know anything about God? How do we know? In the Word. That's it. If he doesn't reveal himself to us, we don't know anything about him. I mean, it's not like, you can just pick up any old book and read about it. It's not like history. It's not like, all the things that we studied in school. If God wants us to know about him, he has to reveal it to us in his Word, because he is high and above us. So we've been doing a class in Romans on Wednesday night, if the weather holds out, So we missed like 2 weeks out of 4 so far, I think. But one of the things I've been walking through over the past few years is unlearning things that I've learned. I was raised in church, and I spent some time in the wilderness wandering around there, like a lot of us have, in our teenage and early 20s. And, it took me a little longer than some, maybe, to figure out where I needed to be and come back and settle. But I don't think that any of that's an accident, And when we're reading in Romans, there's some stuff in there that confronts us, that says, we're not as free as we think we are to make decisions and do things, because according to Paul, salvation is all of the Lord. If he doesn't choose you to choose to save you, then you're condemned. We've condemned ourselves. Let's put it that way. By who we are and by our sin nature, we are already condemned. And so there are a lot of people that don't like that. And the problem with the stuff that we read a lot of times is that it paints an incomplete picture of who God is. And there's conflicting things. And, you've got somebody that's infinite, that has infinite attributes that we can't understand. And so you've got pictures of God, and in John, he says God is love, And that's something that we grab a hold of that, because that's really appealing to us, that God is love, He loves us, and he wants us to be with him, and he's done all these things to save us because he loves us. And that's true. That's 100% true. But Moses says that our God is a consuming fire. He's a jealous God. And David in the Psalms talks about the unfailing love and the faithfulness of God. And that's just a few things that the Word says about him through different people that have written over the course of human history. But how do we put those things together? How do we put all that and make any kind of picture out of it? And men and women have talked and studied for centuries to try to make sense of all that. Now, how do we balance the love of God with his justice? How do we balance mercy with justice? How do we, and we have, huge books of theology that are written that say, well, Jesus had to do this because of that. He's the one that he satisfied the justice of God and was the embodiment of his mercy by coming to die for us. So I'm not even going to try that. I'm not going to try to pull it all together, because the thing that's been standing out to me, I think that we've gotten a place where we forget a little bit about who this God is that we serve. That sometimes we look at him like, I don't even want to say it that way, but I'm going to anyway. I mean, we look at him like this genie in the lamp, that we can pull the lamp out and we can pray our prayers and rub this lamp and get our wishes granted. And that's not who God is. That's not who he is. God is the sovereign of the universe. He created it all, He rules it all, and He determines what's going to happen. Now, we don't like that because we like the illusion that we have choice in everything that we do. But that's just not true. So, this morning I want to talk to you a little bit about the sovereignty of God. And at the end, we'll see why it's important that we realize how sovereign He is. As we're singing these songs about how God's with us. If God's not sovereign, who cares if He's with us? Because what's He going to do? If He is not the one that controls everything, if He's not the one that can create life from death, what difference does it make in our life whether He's, we say, who could stand against us? Who could stand against the chosen of God? Well, if God is not sovereign, if He doesn't rule, then anything can happen. So it's important that we understand that aspect of Him. So what we need to do first is to define what we mean by that. So what do we mean by the sovereignty of God? A.W. Tozer, who was an evangelist and a preacher, and if you never had an opportunity to read Tozer, you should, because he's down on a level where everybody can understand, and he has a way of putting things that you won't forget. He's just got a way with words and breaking things down and really challenging the thinking of Christians about who God really is. But he has a little book called The Knowledge of the Holy. And it goes into all the attributes of God. And it's short. Each section is short. So, you could read it and you could download it. So you could search on Google and find it and download it and you can read it. And I recommend that you do. Because there was and he quotes this person, but I didn't write it down, that he says, no society ever rises above their view of God. So if we have a country, a culture, a people who don't view their God the way we view our God, then you're at the whim of people and things and events that you have no control over, that your gods don't have any control over. If you are like some of the cultures in Africa that worship everything. That everything is God. Well, how do you know how do you know what to worship and what not to worship? And you find in these cultures that they give sacrifices to try to appease these gods because they're angry and they're, so our image of God is really important to who we are as a culture and a people and a nation. And Tozer says in his book that to be sovereign, God must be all-knowing, He must be all-powerful, and completely free. Now, we don't have any problem with the first two. Generally we look at it and we say, yeah, we can agree God is all-powerful. He can do anything He wants, and He's all-knowing. He has control over everything, because if He doesn't know everything, then something could surprise Him. And then He wouldn't be prepared for it. Some people preach the fall of Adam and Eve like that was a surprise to God. That wasn't a surprise to God, like Dustin said. He knew from the beginning what was going to happen. Now, my question always is, are we worth it? Are we worth everything that He's had to go through to create and then redeem us? That's the question I ask. But He's God and He's all-knowing. So in the end, because He's all-knowing and all-powerful, then to Him it's worth it. And we'll understand someday. I'm confident that when we see Him and we know Him, that those things will be revealed to us. But like now, we can't see it. But we have some issues with this idea of complete freedom, because being completely free means you can do really anything. And Tozer compares us to the image of a bird. Like we'll say, well, they are as free as a bird. Is a bird free? Can a bird do whatever it wants to do? It can't. I watch a lot of nature shows. And you know, because I like that kind of stuff. Like I said, I'm a thinker. I think about things and I like to know things. So I watch these nature shows and I watch these birds. And the birds are not free. They're not free to go anywhere they want. They're not free to do anything they want to do. They're controlled by their nature. They're controlled by their food sources. They're controlled by how they've adapted to where they live. Now, all you have to do is watch one of these shows and listen to them talk about how we're about to kill off this rare bird, right? If this bird was completely free, he'd just pack up and move, right? He would go somewhere else. But he can't because he's not free, and neither are we. We're constrained by our own nature, but God's not constrained like that. He's the Lord of all. His will cannot be changed. It cannot be thwarted by anything. Whatever he purposes to do, he can do that. You know, we can't understand that kind of thing because, well, you know, every time we get in the car to go somewhere, my purposes are thwarted. You know, we plan a trip somewhere, you know, it doesn't matter what it is. We could be going to the mall, we could be going to eat, and it never goes the way that I'm picturing it in my mind that it's going to happen. Right? There's always somebody between me and where I need to be that's in my way. So my will is thwarted all the time. So we have a hard time understanding a God who is, he can't be stopped. There's nothing that can stop what he wants to accomplish. So here's the question. And this is a legitimate question that I've had after reading some of these things that Paul has had to say about, you know, our choice. Do we have any choice at all? If God is all-powerful and controls everything, do we actually have any choice in anything at all? So Tozer, he gives this illustration. So if you imagine there's a passenger ship, and it's going from New York to Liverpool in England. And there's a bunch of people on there. Okay? So here's the ship, and it's going across the ocean. Now, the people that are on the boat, they can do pretty much whatever they want within the confines of the boat and within, you know, normal human activity. You know, I mean, you can't get crazy with it. This is just an analogy to try to give us an illustration. Whatever they do on the boat's going to Liverpool, right? It's going to Liverpool. It's not going to France. It's not going to Spain. The boat is going to Liverpool. And the people on the boat, they can't control that. They have no control over that. They're just wandering around. They're eating at the buffet. You know, they're laying in the sun. And they're doing whatever it is that they're doing on the boat. And they can do that. They can make those choices. But it has no effect on the outcome of where that boat's going. Are you hearing what I'm saying? So, God is in charge of the boat. We're going from point A to point B. And what we do in the middle has very little effect on that. It's not going to change what God wants to do. That boat's going to the end. So, we can do what we want within the limits of our nature, but we can't change the end destination. We're not going to change the plan. And I know that's not perfect because, you know, they could decide to throw a mutiny and turn the boat because they don't want to go to Liverpool because it's cold and wet. They want to go to the south of France or whatever. They could hijack. But, you know, within reason, the boat's going to go where the boat's going to go. And that's us. You know, God's in control and he's taking it where he's going to go. So I want to look at how some of this works out in history because we do, you know, I could stand here and talk to you for like an hour, but we're supposed to read some Bible. So let's do, you know, let's look at that. So let's look at Exodus chapter 7. I want to look at how this first example, I want to show you how God is sovereign over the hearts of men. That he, even the will of no man can stop the will of God when he wants to accomplish something. So Exodus 7, 1 through 5. And the Lord said to Moses, "See, I have made you like God to Pharaoh, and your brother Aaron shall be your prophet. You shall speak all that I command you, and your brother Aaron shall tell the Pharaoh to let the people of Israel go out of his land." But I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and though I multiply my signs and wonders in Egypt, Pharaoh will not listen to you. Then I will lay my hand on Egypt and bring my host, my people, the children of Israel, out of the land of Egypt by great acts of judgment. The Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I stretch my hand out against Egypt and bring out the people of Israel among them. So what do we see? God's got a plan. He's bringing his people out of Egypt. He's bringing Israel out of Egypt. If you look at verse 3, which I'm sure you noted while I was reading it, what it says here, God says he will harden Pharaoh's heart. It doesn't say Pharaoh's hardening his own heart. It doesn't say, Pharaoh's just not going to listen to you because he's hard-headed, He doesn't want all those people to go. God specifically says that he hardens Pharaoh's heart. So why would he do that? Wouldn't it be just as easy for him to say, well, I'm going to make Pharaoh listen to you, and then everybody can get on out of here, and you guys could pack up and move out. So why would he want to do that? Why would God put it in his... Because if we're making the argument that God's sovereign, right, he could just as easily do the other. Because just as easily with us, he softens our heart to receive and hear and receive the gospel, right? That's what we teach, that's what we preach. It's the Holy Spirit comes to us as the gospel is preached, and it testifies to us that that's the truth. And he opens our heart to be able to receive that. So couldn't he do that to Pharaoh? Like Moses walks in, everything's fine. Pharaoh says, hey, I like you, Moses, so you can take all this stuff with you and just get on your way. You guys go do whatever it is you need to do. We'll be all right, even though we depend on you to build everything. It could happen, but it didn't. And why? Because God had, in verse 5, he wants to show who he is, so that Egypt will know he was God. And I also believe, because you've got a people who haven't served him, who don't know him, who Moses comes and they go, and he, God tells Moses, tell them I am sent you. And they're like, I seem to remember that someday from stories that my grandparents told me, that they served a God who was called I am, that I am. But we haven't served him in like 300-400 years. So do you think they needed a little assurance of who it was that was bringing them out? That he was going to lead them, he was going to take them where he was planning to take them. Again, they're on the boat. God says, we're going here. That's where we're going. And I'm going to show Pharaoh who I am in the meantime. I'm going to show him in this thing. So let's skip to, this goes on and on. This whole deal with Pharaoh. Of course, you know the story. Pharaoh, they don't listen. But it changes a little bit. The story changes a little bit. If you skip to chapter 8:15, which we don't, I'll tell you what it says. After the first 2 plagues, this is what it says about Pharaoh. It says, but when Pharaoh saw there was a respite, he hardened his heart and would not listen to them as the Lord had said. So this one says Pharaoh hardened his own heart. This wasn't the Lord hardening his heart. This was him hardening his own heart. So, which one is it? Did God harden it? Did he harden it? Well, I think, this is my opinion, because I'm just a man and don't have like holy credentials here, I think it's both. The same as it is with us, God reinforces the nature and will of Pharaoh. Pharaoh didn't want to let him go. He might have been able to be convinced that it was in his own interest to let them go if he knew what was going to happen to him. And in the end, he lost like all of his army, he lost all of his slaves. He had a bad time of it. If he knew that was going to happen, maybe he would have agreed. But he didn't want to. And so it is with us. We hear the gospel, and we talked about this on Wednesday. When you hear the gospel, you're either hardened to it or you're open to it. And the more you hear it, and the more you aren't open to it, the more hardened you become. So it's only because of the grace of God that we're ever able to receive it. And so what about that person that's hardened to the gospel when he hears it? You know, I'm sure that we've run into people like that. They look at you like you're crazy. It's like you tell them, you're a sinner and Jesus died for you, and if you do this and accept him, and it's like they look at you like, what are you even talking about? They're not picking up what you're laying down at all. Not at all. And their heart is hardened to it. But it's the hardness of our own heart. That our hearts are already hard. And that God, it's already our nature. So if God does anything, it's only a reinforcement of our nature to not accept and not believe and not trust him. And as we one line in our Roman study really stood out to me. People will say, well, that's not fair. That God chooses these and doesn't choose those, or he chooses these and he condemns those. But nobody ever says that God should condemn us all, which is the truth. That we're all sinners. And if we ever get to the point where we don't realize that we're sinners saved by grace and grace alone, then we're in some trouble. But nobody ever says that God should condemn everybody. They say, well, he should save everybody then. Well, that's not the way it works, because God's sovereign. And a sovereign God is sovereign over the hearts of men. So I want to shift gears a little bit and look at how God is sovereign in history. So let's look at Israel's captivity in Babylon and their restoration. Through Jeremiah, God predicts the means and outcomes of Israel's captivity before it happens. Only a God that's sovereign can tell you what's going to happen before it's going to happen, because that's not like the fortune teller with the crystal ball that's telling you your future. God knows it's going to happen because he's going to make it happen. There is no chance that it's not going to happen when he tells you it's going to happen, because he's the one that's going to make it happen, because he's sovereign. And he will accomplish what he purposes to accomplish. So Jeremiah 25, 8 through 14. Therefore, thus says the Lord of hosts, because you have not obeyed my words, behold, I will send all the tribes of the north, declares the Lord, and for Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, my servant, and I will bring them against this land and its inhabitants, and against all these surrounding nations. I will devote them to destruction, and make them a horror, a hissing, and an everlasting desolation. That doesn't sound good. I mean, it's got a hissing in there. I don't know what that means exactly, but that can't be good. Moreover, I will banish from them the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, and the voice of the bridegroom and the voice of the bride, and the grinding of millstones and the light of the lamp. The whole land shall become a ruin and a waste. And these nations shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years. Then after 70 years are completed, I will punish the king of Babylon, which is confusing because God's the one that's sending him there. And the nation, the land of the Chaldeans, for their iniquity, declares the Lord, making the land an everlasting waste. I will bring upon that land all the words I have uttered against it, everything written in this book, which Jeremiah prophesied against all the nations. For many nations and great kings shall make slaves even of them, and I will recompense them according to their deeds and the dark work of their hands. Now, there's no question they deserve judgment. They were not good people. They were not godly people. They were not good people. But look at verse 8. This always strikes me when I read it, because here we have an ungodly king. And not a little bit ungodly, a lot ungodly. And here God says he's my servant. What kind of God says that an ungodly king is his servant? The kind of God that controls what happens. So here we have people who are not his servants, who are not his people. He's not just controlling the people that are listening, he's controlling the people that aren't listening, that aren't paying attention to what he says. God controls the rise and fall of nations. Is that right? He's in charge. Now, we get all bent out of shape about elections, about who's in charge and who's not in charge. And, if we get this guy in there, he's going to do great things. And if this other person gets elected, it's bad. It's going to be real bad. Who's in charge? God's in charge. Our job as citizens, because we live in a representative republic, not a democracy. Not a democracy. Because a democracy is mob rules. You only need 51 out of 100 to decide somebody's fate. So, it is our duty as citizens to pray for our leaders and to be part of our country, the fabric of our country, to vote for the best candidates that we can. But who's in charge? God's in charge. If Trump gets elected, everything's not going to be all great. And if he doesn't get elected, it's going to be fine. It's going to be fine. If we survived 8 years of Obama, he's in charge, right? Really, when you look at history, God controls who's in charge and who's not in charge for His purposes. Do you think it was a coincidence that Nebuchadnezzar was where he was? No. Do you think it was a coincidence that Nebuchadnezzar had the power that he did? He had the army that he did. Now, Nebuchadnezzar's story is interesting, and we're not really going to talk about this, but he had a one-on-one with God himself and had to be taught that he wasn't the one that was in charge. But everything happened exactly like Jeremiah predicted. Exactly. They came down, they took over the place, they took them into captivity, and after 70 years, the restoration came. Babylon was overthrown by the kingdom of Persia. They were completely absorbed into the Persian Empire, and they don't exist anymore in any way, shape, or form. After they were overthrown as a country, as a separate entity, they don't exist in history. They're gone, just like God said. He didn't say they were going to get defeated, but it was going to be okay for them. He said He was going to wipe them off. They're gone. They're going to be completely and utterly destroyed. Just as predicted by Jeremiah and Daniel. In Daniel, he tells, the vision of the statue, and he talks about all the kingdoms. It happened exactly like he said. And just as predicted, under Cyrus, the prophecy of Jeremiah was fulfilled, and the people were restored to their land. So let's pick up in the book of Ezra. I'm aiming to be faster than you were last week. I got some time left. Ezra 1 through 11. In the first year of Cyrus king of Persia, the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled. The Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus king of Persia, so that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom and also put it in writing. Thus says Cyrus king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and He has charged me to build Him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you, of all His people, may his God be with him, and let him go to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and rebuild the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. He is the God who is in Jerusalem. Well, that tells you a little bit about, in that time, the gods were local. So I don't even think, Cyrus is talking about He's Lord, and He's Lord in Jerusalem. Well, Baal was here, and this is the God of Jerusalem, and this is the God of Syria. So their understanding of Him being the Lord of all, I don't think was complete, but it didn't really matter, because He's sending them back, and He said, let each survivor in whatever place he sojourns be assisted by the men of his place with silver and gold, with goods and beasts, besides free will offerings for the house of God that is in Jerusalem. Then rose up the heads of the fathers' houses of Judah and Benjamin, and the priests and the Levites, and everyone whose spirit God had stirred to go up to rebuild the house of the Lord that is in Jerusalem. And all who were with them aided them with vessels of silver and gold, with goods and beasts and costly wares, besides all that was freely offered. Cyrus the king also brought out the vessels of the house of the Lord that Nebuchadnezzar had carried away from Jerusalem and placed in the house of his gods. Cyrus, the king of Persia, brought these out in the charge of Mithridates, the treasurer, who counted them out to Sheshbazzar, the prince of Judah. Why could they have easy names like, Bob and Joe and, And this was the number of them: 30 basins of gold, 1,000 basins of silver, 29 censers, 1,030 bowls of gold, 410 bowls of silver, and 1,000 other vessels. All the vessels, 30 bowls of gold, sorry. All of the vessels of gold and silver were 5,400. All these did Sheshbazzar bring up when the exiles were brought up from Babylonia to Jerusalem. Now Ezra, he says specifically, this is the fulfillment of the prophecy. God said, 70 years, and I'm going to come and get you back out. Why were they in Babylon to start with? Because they were disobedient. They were bad, So they got put in time out. Their time out lasted like a whole generation, 70 years, So, if you get put in time out, because God puts us in time out, doesn't He? God disciplines those He loves, because if you're not disciplined, you're an illegitimate child. If God is not trying to correct you, either you're really, really good, which I highly doubt, or you're an illegitimate child. So He is, here's the beauty part. This is a sidebar you get for free. God is in the business of conforming us to the image of His Son. And regardless of how we feel about that, He's going to accomplish it. Which is good for us, because I don't know about you, but from one day to the next, it's hard to tell what I'm going to want. I may not want to be corrected today. I may not want to be conformed today, but He's going to do what He's going to do, and He's going to accomplish what He needs to accomplish in us. And sometimes we get put in time out. So that's where they were. They were in time out for 70 years. It's interesting. I can get a drink. At least to me, that Cyrus claims to have been charged by God with rebuilding the temple. So here we are. I did a little looking about Cyrus yesterday while I was going through this, and Cyrus is not particularly godly either. He was just like all the other kings of that era. He was determined to pretty much rule all the world that he could find, and that's what he did. But it doesn't say that he was particularly godly. It says that the Jews held him in high esteem. That they actually looked at him like a Messiah, because he did what God said that he was going to do. He let them go back to the land. So what was the purpose of letting the people go back? Ezra tells us right here, the purpose of going back was so that they could rebuild the temple. So again, this is all about God. This isn't about them. This is about God. Your job is to go back and rebuild the temple. So when Nehemiah comes around later on, because that used to be one book. We split it. Ezra and Nehemiah was all one book. Nehemiah comes and he's like, everybody's living in their houses, but the temple's not finished. What's going on? And so he had to, pull them back in line, and they had to finish what had been begun a generation before. That the purpose of returning was to reestablish worship. That here's God, these people are going to go back, they're going to rebuild the temple and reestablish the worship of me. I'm empowering them to do it, and they're going to go do it. That's what I want them to do. So God worked through a pagan king to destroy one kingdom and to reestablish His own house back in Jerusalem, because He's a sovereign God and He can keep His promises. He made a promise to His people that they would be there 70 years and then He would restore them to the land. And that's exactly what He did. All the promises, we don't have time to go through the whole Old Testament. All the promises that He made them, He's fulfilled. There's a few promises that are in the Bible that are not fulfilled yet, but His track record's pretty good. If you're at 100% now, I think I'll give him credit for what's yet to come, right? So, what does this mean to us? You can come up, Dustin, if you want to. He likes it when I tell him, don't give him clues. Just tell him, I'm getting ready to close. So come on up. So what does it mean? Are we nothing but victims of God's will and purpose? No, we're not. God works through people to accomplish His purposes. You can see it all throughout history. Now, why He chose to do it that way, I don't have any idea. That's one of those things that we'll have to ask Him when we get there. You know, why in the world did you choose to do it this way? Because people are unpredictable, but not to God. Because God knows the heart of a man. He knows what He's going to do. He knew what Abraham was going to do before he took Isaac up the mountain. I mean, there's no question. And anytime if you read that any different than that, then you have to account for what the scriptures that say that God knows our hearts. He knows our thoughts. He knows who we are. So sometimes it gets confusing when you read things that seem to contradict, and you just got to back up and you got to say, well, who was He proving that to? He wasn't proving it to Himself. God knew what He was going to do. He was proving it to Abraham. He was proving it to Abraham who Abraham was and who God was. So, God can and does override the will of men. But that's good for us, because if He didn't, who would get saved? How would any of your relatives get saved? If God's not able to override the will of a person, then why would I pray for anybody to get saved? Because whatever's going to happen is going to happen. He's going to do what He's going to do. But God can override their will. And I believe, like Pastor said, you know, when we're praying for people, Jesus died for these people. So I'm asking you, Lord, to give them to Him. Because Jesus doesn't lose any of the ones that the Father gives to Him. That's what the Word says. So when we pray our prayers that are in line with His Word and His will, we can be assured that they're going to be accomplished. Now, we may not see them accomplished, and they may not be accomplished the way that we were hoping, but something's going to happen. God can and does cause the rise and fall of nations. We can be assured, regardless of political winds, that God's always in control. And the early church is a perfect example. You know, Rome was no friend of the Christians, especially as the empire got more and more unstable. They blamed the Christians for everything that happened, and they were persecuted. However, there's been people that have lined out in history, you know, if Jesus was born a little bit earlier or a little bit later than He was, His mission would have been completely impossible. If He'd have been born while the Jews were in control of the land, He couldn't have been crucified, because crucifixion is a Roman punishment, not a Jewish punishment. If He would have called Himself God, they would have stoned Him to death. So that wouldn't have fulfilled prophecy. So He could only be born under the Romans. And if it were later, they probably would have just ignored it. But He was in a period of time where there was kind of where they were not allowed to execute Him. The Jews weren't allowed to execute Him. Only the Romans were. So there was the time period. There's no coincidences in history. God is in control of history. He's control from beginning to end of what's going to happen. But if it weren't for the Romans, the fact that the Romans controlled most of the known world at that time, how would the gospel have spread? How would you go from one country to another, ruled by different people? Paul could travel everywhere. Paul was a Roman citizen. He could travel anywhere within the empire. No questions asked. And they controlled such a huge area. They built roads. So the whole idea that these things happen by accident is, I mean, it's crazy. It's crazy. Even after the fall of Rome, the church had been established so deeply in the culture that it continued to sustain itself when the country's fragmented. And the church, flawed as it was at the time, is our culture that we live in today in the Western world is a result of the Christian church that Paul started during the Empire of Rome. So everything that you take for granted today, if you look around the world and you look at all the countries that Trump doesn't like, and calls by bad names, right? They don't have a history of Christianity, do they? No. Their government, their culture is not based on the gospel. All of Europe, Eastern, Western Europe, the Americas, all those places are based on a Christian culture that gives us what we have today. That people have a right, that they have rights that are given to them by God, not by men. Well, where does that come from? It comes from the Word. It comes from the Word, that we're all made in the image and likeness of God. So we have value just by the fact that we're here, because we are God's creation. So, last but not least, our God is a keeper of promises. And only a sovereign God can give life to the dead and call into being that which does not exist. Romans 4:17. Romans 4:17. He is the God that calls into existence those things which aren't. He is able to do far more abundantly than we can ask or think, according to the power at work within us. Ephesians 3:20. So as Pastor preached at the beginning of this year, pray big prayers knowing that we have a big God who is sovereign and ruler of the universe. He's the only one that we can depend on to keep His promises. That every man, every woman will fail you. But not only is He a good God, He's also a sovereign God who is able to do what He promises to do. And there's only one correct response to being in the presence of the King of Kings, and that's to worship.